Milo was the corn god, the rain god, and the rice god in backward regions where such crude gods were still worshipped by ignorant and superstitious people. And deep inside the jungles of Africa, he intimated with becoming modesty, large graven images of his mustached face could be found overlooking primitive stone altars red with human blood. Everywhere they touched, he was acclaimed with honor, and it was one triumphal ovation after another for him in city after city until they finally doubled back through the Middle East and reached Cairo, where Milo cornered the market on cotton that no one else in the world wanted and brought himself promptly to the brink of ruin. In Cairo, there was at last room at the hotel for Yossarian and Orr. There were soft beds for them with fat, fluffed-up pillows and clean, crisp sheets. There were closets with hangers for their clothes. There was water to wash with. Yossarian and Orr soaked their rancid, unfriendly bodies pink in a steaming hot tub, and then went from the hotel with Milo to eat shrimp cocktails and filet mignon in a very fine restaurant with a stock ticker in the lobby that happened to be clicking out the latest quotation for Egyptian cotton when Milo inquired of the captain of waiters what kind of machine it was. Milo had never imagined a machine so beautiful as a stock ticker before. "Really?" he exclaimed when the captain of waiters had finished his explanation. "And how much is Egyptian cotton selling for?" The captain of waiters told him, and Milo bought the whole crop. But Yossarian was not nearly so frightened by the Egyptian cotton Milo bought as he was by the bunches of green-red bananas Milo had spotted in his native marketplace as they drove into the city. And his fears proved justified, for Milo shook him awake out of a deep sleep just after 12 and shoved a partly peeled banana toward him. Yossarian choked back a sob. "Taste it," Milo urged, following Yossarian's writhing face around with the banana insistently. "Milo, you bastard," moaned Yossarian. "I've got to get some sleep." "Eat it and tell me if it's good," Milo persevered. "Don't tell Orr I gave it to you. I charged him 2 piastres for his." Yossarian ate the banana submissively and closed his eyes after telling Milo it was good, but Milo shook him awake again and instructed him to get dressed as quickly as he could because they were leaving at once for Pianosa. "You and Orr have to load the bananas into the plane right away," he explained. "The man said to watch out for spiders while you're handling the bunches." "Milo, can't we wait until morning?" Yossarian pleaded. "I've got to get some sleep." "They're ripening very quickly," answered Milo, "and we don't have a minute to lose. Just think how happy the men back at the squadron will be when they get these bananas." But the men back at the squadron never even saw any of the bananas, for it was a seller's market for bananas in Istanbul and a buyer's market in Beirut for the caraway seeds Milo rushed with to Benghazi after selling the bananas. And when they raced back into Pianosa breathlessly 6 days later, at the conclusion of Orr's rest leave, it was with a load of best white eggs from Sicily that Milo said were from Egypt and sold to his mess halls for only 4 cents apiece, so that all the commanding officers in his syndicate would implore him to speed right back to Cairo for more bunches of green-red bananas to sell in Turkey for the caraway seeds in demand in Benghazi. And everybody had a share. Chapter 23, Nately's Old Man. The only one back in the squadron who did see any of Milo's red bananas was Arfi, who picked up 2 from an influential fraternity brother of his in the quartermaster corps when the bananas ripened and began streaming into Italy through normal black market channels, and who was in the officer's apartment with Yossarian the evening Nately finally found his whore again after so many fruitless weeks of mournful searching, and lured her back to the apartment with 2 girlfriends by promising them $30 each. $30 each, remarked Arfi slowly, poking and patting each of the 3 strapping girls skeptically, with the air of a grudging connoisseur. $30 is a lot of money for pieces like these. Besides, I never paid for it in my life. I'm not asking you to pay for it, Nately assured him quickly. I'll pay for them all. I just want you guys to take the other 2. Won't you help me out? Arfi smirked complacently and shook his soft round head. Nobody has to pay it for good old Arfi. I can get all I want any time I want. I'm just not in the mood right now. Why don't you just pay all 3 and send the other 2 away, Yossarian suggested. Because then mine will be angry with me for making her work for her money, Nately replied with an anxious look at his girl, who was glowering at him restlessly and starting to mutter. She says that if I really liked her, I'd send her away and go to bed with one of the others. "I have a better idea," boasted Arfie. "Why don't we keep the three of them here until after the curfew and then threaten to push them out into the street to be arrested unless they give us all their money? We can even threaten to push them out the window." "Arfie!" Nately was aghast. "I was only trying to help," said Arfie sheepishly. Arfie was always trying to help Nately, because Nately's father was rich and prominent and in an excellent position to help Arfie after the war. "Gee whiz," he defended himself querulously. "Back in school, we were always doing things like that. I remember one day we tricked these two dumb high school girls from town into the fraternity house and made them put out for all the fellas there who wanted them by threatening to call up their parents and say they were putting out for us. We kept them trapped in bed there for more than 10 hours. We even smacked their faces a little when they started to complain. Then we took away their nickels and dimes and chewing gum and threw them out. Boy, we used to have fun in that fraternity house," he recalled peacefully, his corpulent cheeks aglow with the jovial, rubicund warmth of nostalgic recollection. "We used to ostracize everyone, even each other." But Arfie was no help to Nately now, as the girl Nately had fallen so deeply in love with began swearing at him sullenly with rising, menacing resentment. Luckily, Hungry Joe burst in just then, and everything was all right again, except that Dunbar staggered in drunk a minute later and began embracing one of the other giggling girls at once. Now there were 4 men and 3 girls, and the 7 of them left Arfie in the apartment and climbed into a horse-drawn cab, which remained at the curb at a dead halt, while the girls demanded their money in advance. Nately gave them $90 with a gallant flourish after borrowing $20 from Yossarian, $35 from Dunbar, and $17 from Hungry Joe. The girls grew friendlier then and called an address to the driver, who drove them at a clopping pace halfway across the city into a section they had never visited before, and stopped in front of an old, tall building on a dark street. The girls led them up 4 steep, very long flights of creaking wooden stairs, and guided them through a doorway into their own wonderful and resplendent tenement apartment, which burgeoned miraculously with an infinite and proliferating flow of supple young naked girls, and contained the evil and debauched ugly old man who irritated Nately constantly with his caustic laughter, and the clucking proper old woman in the ash-gray woolen sweater who disapproved of everything immoral that occurred there and tried her best to tidy up. The amazing place was a fertile, seething cornucopia of female nipples and navels. At first, there were just their own 3 girls in the dimly lit drab-brown sitting room that stood at the juncture of 3 murky hallways, leading in separate directions to the distant recesses of the strange and marvelous bordello. The girls disrobed at once, pausing in different stages to point proudly to their garish underthings, and bantering all the while with the gaunt and dissipated old man with the shabby long white hair and slovenly white unbuttoned shirt, who sat cackling lasciviously in a musty blue armchair almost in the exact center of the room, and bade Nately and his companions welcome with a mirthful and sardonic formality. Then the old woman trudged out to get a girl for Hungry Joe, dipping her captious head sadly, and returned with 2 big-bosomed beauties, one already undressed and the other in only a transparent pink half-slip that she wiggled out of while sitting down. 3 more naked girls sauntered in from a different direction and remained to chat, then 2 others. 4 more girls passed through the room in an indolent group, engrossed in conversation. 3 were barefoot, and 1 wobbled perilously on a pair of unbuckled silver dancing shoes that did not seem to be her own. 1 more girl appeared wearing only panties and sat down, bringing the total congregating there in just a few minutes to 11, all but one of them completely unclothed. There was bare flesh lounging everywhere, most of it plump, and Hungry Joe began to die. He stood stock still in rigid cataleptic astonishment while the girls ambled in and made themselves comfortable. Then he let out a piercing shriek suddenly and bolted toward the door in a headlong dash back toward the enlisted men's apartment for his camera, only to be halted in his tracks with another frantic shriek by the dreadful freezing premonition that this whole lovely, lurid, rich, and colorful pagan paradise would be snatched away from him irredeemably if he were to let it out of his sight for even an instant. He stopped in the doorway and sputtered, the wiry veins and tendons in his face and neck pulsating violently. The old man watched him with victorious merriment, sitting in his musty blue armchair like some satanic and hedonistic deity on a throne. a stolen U.S. Army blanket wrapped around his spindly legs to ward off a chill. He laughed quietly, his sunken, shrewd eyes sparkling perceptively with a cynical and wanton enjoyment. He had been drinking. Nately reacted on sight with bristling enmity to this wicked, depraved, and unpatriotic old man who was old enough to remind him of his father, and who made disparaging jokes about America. America, he said, will lose the war, and Italy will win it. America is the strongest and most prosperous nation on earth, Nately informed him with lofty fervor and dignity, and the American fighting man is second to none. Exactly, agreed the old man pleasantly with a hint of taunting amusement. Italy, on the other hand, is one of the least prosperous nations on earth, and the Italian fighting man is probably second to all. And that's exactly why my country is doing so well in this war, while your country is doing so poorly. Nately guffawed with surprise, then blushed apologetically for his impoliteness. I'm sorry I laughed at you, he said sincerely, and he continued in a tone of respectful condescension. But Italy was occupied by the Germans, and is now being occupied by us. You don't call that doing very well, do you? But of course I do, exclaimed the old man cheerfully. The Germans are being driven out, and we are still here. In a few years you will be gone too, and we will still be here. You see, Italy is really a very poor and weak country, and that's what makes us so strong. Italian soldiers are not dying anymore, but American and German soldiers are. I call that doing extremely well. Yes, I am quite certain that Italy will survive this war and still be in existence long after your own country has been destroyed. Nately could scarcely believe his ears. He had never heard such shocking blasphemies before, and he wondered with instinctive logic why G-men did not appear to lock the traitorous old man up. America is not going to be destroyed, he shouted passionately. Never? Prodded the old man softly. Well, Nately faltered. The old man laughed indulgently, holding in check a deeper, more explosive delight. His goading remained gentle. Rome was destroyed, Greece was destroyed, Persia was destroyed, Spain was destroyed. All great countries are destroyed. Why not yours? How much longer do you really think your own country will last? Forever? Keep in mind that the earth itself is destined to be destroyed by the sun in 25 million years or so. Nately squirmed uncomfortably. Well, forever is a long time, I guess. 1,000,000 years? Persisted the jeering old man with keen, sadistic zest. 500,000? The frog is almost 500 million years old. Could you really say with much certainty that America, with all its strength and prosperity, with its fighting man that is second to none, and with its standard of living that is the highest in the world, will last as long as the frog? Nately wanted to smash his leering face. He looked about imploringly for help in defending his country's future against the obnoxious calumnies of this sly and sinful assailant. He was disappointed. Yossarian and Dunbar were busy in a far corner pawing orgiastically at 4 or 5 frolicsome girls and 6 bottles of red wine, and Hungry Joe had long since tramped away down one of the mystic hallways, propelling before him like a ravening despot as many of the broadest-hipped young prostitutes as he could contain in his frail, windmilling arms and cram into one double bed. Nately felt himself at an embarrassing loss. His own girl sat sprawled out gracelessly on an overstuffed sofa with an expression of otiose boredom. Nately was unnerved by her torpid indifference to him, by the same sleepy and inert poise that he remembered so vividly, so sweetly, and so miserably from the first time she had seen him and ignored him at the packed penny-ante blackjack game in the living room of the enlisted men's apartment. Her lax mouth hung open in a perfect O, and God alone knew at what her glazed and smoky eyes were staring in such brute apathy. The old man waited tranquilly, watching him with a discerning smile that was both scornful and sympathetic. A lissom, blonde, sinuous girl with lovely legs and honey-colored skin laid herself out contentedly on the arm of the old man's chair and began molesting his angular, pale, dissolute face languidly and coquettishly. Nately stiffened with resentment and hostility at the sight of such lechery in a man so old. He turned away with a sinking heart and wondered why he simply did not take his own girl and go to bed. This sordid, vulturous, diabolical old man reminded Nately of his father, because the two were nothing at all alike. Nately's father was a courtly, white-haired gentleman who dressed impeccably. This old man was an uncouth bum. Nately's father was a sober, philosophical, and responsible man. This old man was fickle and licentious. Nately's father was discreet and cultured. This old man was a boor. Nately's father believed in honor and knew the answer to everything. This old man believed in nothing and had only questions. Nately's father had a distinguished white mustache. This old man had no mustache at all. Nately's father, and everyone else's father Nately had ever met, was dignified, wise, and venerable. This old man was utterly repellent, and Nately plunged back into debate with him, determined to repudiate his vile logic and insinuations with an ambitious vengeance that would capture the attention of the bored, phlegmatic girl he had fallen so intensely in love with, and win her admiration forever. Well, frankly, I don't know how long America is going to last, he proceeded dauntlessly. I suppose we can't last forever if the world itself is going to be destroyed someday. But I do know that we're going to survive and triumph for a long, long time. For how long? Mocked the profane old man with a gleam of malicious elation. Not even as long as the frog? Much longer than you or me, Nately blurted out lamely. Oh, is that all? That won't be very much longer then, considering that you're so gullible and brave, and that I am already such an old man. How old are you? Nately asked, growing intrigued and charmed with the old man in spite of himself. 107. The old man chuckled heartily at Nately's look of chagrin. I see you don't believe that either. I don't believe anything you tell me, Nately replied with a bashful, mitigating smile. The only thing I do believe is that America is going to win the war. You put so much stock in winning wars, the grubby, iniquitous old man scoffed. The real trick lies in losing wars, in knowing which wars can be lost. Italy has been losing wars for centuries, and just see how splendidly we've done nonetheless. France wins wars and is in a continual state of crisis. Germany loses and prospers. Look at our own recent history. Italy won a war in Ethiopia and promptly stumbled into serious trouble. Victory gave us such insane delusions of grandeur that we helped start a world war we hadn't a chance of winning. But now that we are losing again, everything has taken a turn for the better, and we will certainly come out on top again if we succeed in being defeated. Nately gaped at him in undisguised befuddlement. Now I really don't understand what you're saying. You talk like a madman. But I live like a sane one. I was a fascist when Mussolini was on top, and I am an anti-fascist now that he has been deposed. I was fanatically pro-German when the Germans were here to protect us against the Americans, and now that the Americans are here to protect us against the Germans, I am fanatically pro-American. I can assure you, my outraged young friend, the old man's knowing, disdainful eyes shone even more effervescently as Nately's stuttering dismay increased, that you and your country will have a no more loyal partisan in Italy than me, but only as long as you remain in Italy. But, Nately cried out in disbelief, you're a turncoat, a time server, a shameful, unscrupulous opportunist. I am 107 years old, the old man reminded him suavely. Don't you have any principles? Of course not. No morality? Oh, I am a very moral man, the villainous old man assured him with satiric seriousness, stroking the bare hip of a buxom black-haired girl with pretty dimples who had stretched herself out seductively on the other arm of his chair. He grinned at Nately sarcastically as he sat between both naked girls in smug and threadbare splendor, with a sovereign hand on each. I can't believe it, Nately remarked grudgingly, trying stubbornly not to watch him in relationship to the girls. I simply can't believe it. But it's all perfectly true. When the Germans marched into the city, I danced in the streets like a youthful ballerina and shouted Heil Hitler until my lungs were hoarse. I even waved a small Nazi flag that I had snatched away from a beautiful little girl while her mother was looking the other way. When the Germans left the city, I rushed out to welcome the Americans with a bottle of excellent brandy and a basket of flowers. The brandy was for myself, of course, and the flowers were to sprinkle upon our liberators. There was a very stiff and stuffy old major riding in the first car, and I hit him squarely in the eye with a red rose. A marvelous shot. You should have seen him wince. Nately gasped and was on his feet with amazement, the blood draining from his cheeks. Major Blank de Coverley, he cried. "Do you know him?" inquired the old man with delight. "What a charming coincidence." Nately was too astounded even to hear him. "So you're the one who wounded Major Blank de Coverley," he exclaimed in horrified indignation. "How could you do such a thing?" The fiendish old man was unperturbed. "How could I resist, you mean? You should have seen the arrogant old boor sitting there so sternly in that car like the Almighty himself, with his big, rigid head and his foolish, solemn face. What a tempting target he made. I got him in the eye with an American Beauty rose. I thought that was most appropriate, don't you?" "That was a terrible thing to do," Nately shouted at him reproachfully. "A vicious and criminal thing. Major Blank de Coverley is our squadron executive officer." "Is he?" teased the unregenerate old man, pinching his pointy jaw gravely in a parody of repentance. "In that case, you must give me credit for being impartial. When the Germans rode in, I almost stabbed a robust young Oberleutnant to death with a sprig of Edelweiss." Nately was appalled and bewildered by the abominable old man's inability to perceive the enormity of his offense. "Don't you realize what you've done?" he scolded vehemently. "Major Blank de Coverley is a noble and wonderful person, and everyone admires him." "He is a silly old fool who really has no right acting like a silly young fool. Where is he today? Dead?" Nately answered softly with somber awe. "Nobody knows. He seems to have disappeared." "You see? Imagine a man his age risking what little life he has left for something so absurd as a country." Nately was instantly up in arms again. "There is nothing so absurd about risking your life for your country," he declared. "Isn't there?" asked the old man. "What is a country? A country is a piece of land surrounded on all sides by boundaries, usually unnatural. Englishmen are dying for England, Americans are dying for America, Germans are dying for Germany, Russians are dying for Russia. There are now 50 or 60 countries fighting in this war. Surely so many countries can't all be worth dying for." "Anything worth living for," said Nately, "is worth dying for." "And anything worth dying for," answered the sacrilegious old man, "is certainly worth living for. You know, you're such a pure and naive young man that I almost feel sorry for you. How old are you? 25? 26? 19, said Nately. "I'll be 20 in January." "If you live," the old man shook his head, wearing, for a moment, the same touchy, meditating frown of the fretful and disapproving old woman. "They are going to kill you if you don't watch out, and I can see now that you are not going to watch out. Why don't you use some sense and try to be more like me? You might live to be 107, too." "Because it's better to die on one's feet than live on one's knees," Nately retorted with triumphant and lofty conviction. "I guess you've heard that saying before." "Yes, I certainly have," mused the treacherous old man, smiling again. "But I'm afraid you have it backward. It is better to live on one's feet than die on one's knees. That is the way the saying goes." "Are you sure?" Nately asked with sober confusion. "It seems to make more sense my way." "No, it makes more sense my way. Ask your friends." Nately turned to ask his friends and discovered they had gone. Yossarian and Dunbar had both disappeared. The old man roared with contemptuous merriment at Nately's look of embarrassed surprise. Nately's face darkened with shame. He vacillated helplessly for a few seconds, and then spun himself around and fled inside the nearest of the hallways in search of Yossarian and Dunbar, hoping to catch them in time and bring them back to the rescue with news of the remarkable clash between the old man and Major Blank de Coverley. All the doors in all the hallways were shut. There was light under none. It was already very late. Nately gave up his search forlornly. There was nothing left for him to do, he realized finally, but get the girl he was in love with and lie down with her somewhere to make tender, courteous love to her and plan their future together. But she had gone off to bed, too, by the time he returned to the sitting room for her, and there was nothing left for him to do then but resume his abortive discussion with the loathsome old man, who rose from his armchair with jesting civility and excused himself for the night, abandoning Nately there with two bleary-eyed girls who could not tell him into which room his own whore had gone, and who padded off to bed several seconds later after trying in vain to interest him in themselves, leaving him to sleep alone in the sitting room on the small, lumpy sofa. Nately was a sensitive, rich, good-looking boy with dark hair, trusting eyes, and a pain in his neck when he awoke on the sofa early the next morning, and wondered dully where he was. His nature was invariably gentle and polite. He had lived for almost 20 years without trauma, tension, hate, or neurosis, which was proof to Yossarian of just how crazy he really was. His childhood had been a pleasant, though disciplined one. He got on well with his brothers and sisters, and he did not hate his mother and father, even though they had both been very good to him. Nately had been brought up to detest people like Arfie, whom his mother characterized as climbers, and people like Milo, whom his father characterized as pushers. But he had never learned how, since he had never been permitted near them. As far back as he could recall, his homes in Philadelphia, New York, Maine, Palm Beach, Southampton, London, Deauville, Paris, and the south of France had always been crowded only with ladies and gentlemen who were not climbers or pushers. Nately's mother, a descendant of the New England Thorntons, was a daughter of the American Revolution. His father was a son of a bitch. Always remember, his mother had reminded him frequently, that you are a Nately. You are not a Vanderbilt whose fortune was made by a vulgar tugboat captain, or a Rockefeller whose wealth was amassed through unscrupulous speculations in crude petroleum, or a Reynolds or Duke whose income was derived from the sale to the unsuspecting public of products containing cancer-causing resins and tars. And you are certainly not an Astor whose family, I believe, still lets rooms. You are a Nately, and the Nateleys have never done anything for their money. What your mother means, son, interjected his father affably one time with that flair for graceful and economical expression Nately admired so much, is that old money is better than new money, and that the newly rich are never to be esteemed as highly as the newly poor. Isn't that correct, my dear? Nately's father brimmed continually with sage and sophisticated counsel of that kind. He was as ebullient and ruddy as mulled claret, and Nately liked him a great deal, although he did not like mulled claret. When war broke out, Nately's family decided that he would enlist in the armed forces, since he was too young to be placed in the diplomatic service, and since his father had it on excellent authority that Russia was going to collapse in a matter of weeks or months, and that Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Mussolini, Gandhi, Franco, Perón, and the Emperor of Japan would then all sign a peace treaty and live together happily ever after. It was Nately's father's idea that he join the Air Corps, where he could train safely as a pilot while the Russians capitulated and the details of the armistice were worked out, and where, as an officer, he would associate only with gentlemen. Instead, he found himself with Yossarian, Dunbar, and Hungry Joe in a whorehouse in Rome, poignantly in love with an indifferent girl there, with whom he finally did lie down the morning after the night he slept alone in the sitting room, only to be interrupted almost immediately by her incorrigible kid sister, who came bursting in without warning and hurled herself onto the bed jealously so that Nately could embrace her too. Nately's whore sprang up snarling to whack her angrily and jerked her to her feet by the hair. The 12-year-old girl looked to Nately like a plucked chicken, or like a twig with the bark peeled off. Her sapling body embarrassed everyone in her precocious attempts to imitate her elders, and she was always being chased away to put clothes on, and ordered out into the street to play in the fresh air with the other children. The two sisters swore and spat at each other now savagely, raising a fluent, deafening commotion that brought a whole crowd of hilarious spectators swarming into the room. Nately gave up in exasperation. He asked his girl to get dressed and took her downstairs for breakfast. The kid sister tagged along, and Nately felt like the proud head of a family as the three of them ate respectably in a nearby open-air cafe. But Nately's whore was already bored by the time they started back, and she decided to go street walking with two other girls rather than spend more time with him. Nately and the kid sister followed meekly a block behind, the ambitious youngster to pick up valuable pointers, Nately to eat his liver in mooning frustration, and both were saddened when the girls were stopped by soldiers in a staff car and driven away. Nately went back to the cafe and bought the kid sister chocolate ice cream until her spirits improved, and then returned with her to the apartment where Yossarian and Dunbar were flopped out in the sitting room with an exhausted Hungry Joe, who was still wearing on his battered face the blissful, numb, triumphant smile with which he had limped into view from his massive harem that morning, like a person with numerous broken bones. The lecherous and depraved old man was delighted with Hungry Joe's split lips and black and blue eyes. He greeted Nately warmly, still wearing the same rumpled clothes of the evening before. Nately was profoundly upset by his seedy and disreputable appearance, and whenever he came to the apartment, he wished that the corrupt, immoral old man would put on a clean Brooks Brothers shirt, shave, comb his hair, wear a tweed jacket, and grow a dapper white mustache, so that Nately would not have to suffer such confusing shame each time he looked at him and was reminded of his father. Chapter 24. Milo. April had been the best month of all for Milo. Lilacs bloomed in April, and fruit ripened on the vine. Heartbeats quickened, and old appetites were renewed. In April, a livelier iris gleamed upon the burnished dove. April was spring, and in the spring Milo Minderbinder's fancy had lightly turned to thoughts of tangerines. Tangerines? Yes, sir. My men would love tangerines, admitted the colonel in Sardinia, who commanded 4 squadrons of B-26s. There'll be all the tangerines they can eat that you're able to pay for with money from your mess fund, Milo assured him. Cassava melons are going for a song in Damascus. I have a weakness for cassava melons. I've always had a weakness for cassava melons. Just lend me 1 plane from each squadron, just 1 plane, and you'll have all the cassavas you can eat that you've money to pay for. We buy from the syndicate, and everybody has a share. It's amazing, positively amazing. How can you do it? Mass purchasing power makes the big difference. For example, breaded veal cutlets. I'm not so crazy about breaded veal cutlets, grumbled the skeptical B-25 commander in the north of Corsica. Breaded veal cutlets are very nutritious, Milo admonished him piously. They contain egg yolk and breadcrumbs, and so are lamb chops. Ah, lamb chops, echoed the B-25 commander. Good lamb chops? The best, said Milo, that the black market has to offer. Baby lamb chops, in the cutest little pink paper panties you ever saw, are going for a song in Portugal. I can't send a plane to Portugal. I haven't the authority. I can, once you lend the plane to me, with a pilot to fly it, and don't forget, you'll get General Dreedle. Will General Dreedle eat in my mess hall again? Like a pig, once you start feeding him my best white fresh eggs, fried in my pure creamery butter. There'll be tangerines, too, and cassava melons, honeydews, filet of Dover sole, baked Alaska, and cockles and mussels. And everybody has a share? That, said Milo, is the most beautiful part of it. I don't like it, growled the uncooperative fighter plane commander, who didn't like Milo either. There's an uncooperative fighter plane commander up north who's got it in for me, Milo complained to General Dreedle. It takes just 1 person to ruin the whole thing, and then you wouldn't have your fresh eggs fried in my pure creamery butter anymore. General Dreedle had the uncooperative fighter plane commander transferred to the Solomon Islands to dig graves, and replaced him with a senile colonel with bursitis and a craving for lychee nuts, who introduced Milo to the B-17 general on the mainland with a yearning for Polish sausage. Polish sausage is going for peanuts in Krakow, Milo informed him. Polish sausage, sighed the general nostalgically. You know, I'd give just about anything for a good hunk of Polish sausage, just about anything. You don't have to give anything. Just give me 1 plane for each mess hall and a pilot who will do what he's told, and a small down payment on your initial order as a token of good faith. But Krakow is hundreds of miles behind the enemy lines. How will you get to the sausage? There's an international Polish sausage exchange in Geneva. I'll just fly the peanuts into Switzerland and exchange them for Polish sausage at the open market rate. They'll fly the peanuts back to Krakow, and I'll fly the Polish sausage back to you. You buy only as much Polish sausage as you want through the syndicate. There'll be tangerines, too, with only a little artificial coloring added. And eggs from Malta, and scotch from Sicily. You'll be paying the money to yourself when you buy from the syndicate, since you'll own a share. So you'll really be getting everything you buy for nothing. Doesn't that make sense? Sheer genius. How in the world did you ever think of it? My name is Milo Minderbinder. I am 27 years old. Milo Minderbinder's planes flew in from everywhere, the pursuit planes, bombers, and cargo ships streaming into Colonel Cathcart's field with pilots at the controls who would do what they were told. The planes were decorated with flamboyant squadron emblems illustrating such laudable ideals as courage, might, justice, truth, liberty, love, honor, and patriotism that were painted out at once by Milo's mechanics with a double coat of flat white and replaced in garish purple with the stenciled name M&M Enterprises, Fine Fruits and Produce. The M&M in M&M Enterprises stood for Milo and Minderbinder, and the "and" was inserted, Milo revealed candidly, to nullify any impression that the syndicate was a one-man operation. Planes arrived for Milo from airfields in Italy, North Africa, and England, and from air transport command stations in Liberia, Ascension Island, Cairo, and Karachi. Pursuit planes were traded for additional cargo ships or retained for emergency invoice duty and small parcel service. Trucks and tanks were procured from the ground forces and used for short-distance road hauling. Everybody had a share, and men got fat and moved about tamely with toothpicks in their greasy lips. Milo supervised the whole expanding operation by himself. Deep, otter brown lines of preoccupation etched themselves permanently into his careworn face, and gave him a harried look of sobriety and mistrust. Everybody but Yossarian thought Milo was a jerk, first for volunteering for the job of mess officer, and next for taking it so seriously. Yossarian also thought that Milo was a jerk, but he also knew that Milo was a genius. One day, Milo flew away to England to pick up a load of Turkish halva and came flying back from Madagascar leading 4 German bombers filled with yams, collards, mustard greens, and black-eyed Georgia peas. Milo was dumbfounded when he stepped down to the ground and found a contingent of armed MPs waiting to imprison the German pilots and confiscate their planes. Confiscate? The mere word was anathema to him, and he stormed back and forth in excoriating condemnation, shaking a piercing finger of rebuke in the guilt-ridden faces of Colonel Cathcart, Colonel Corn, and the poor battle-scarred captain with the submachine gun who commanded the MPs. "Is this Russia?" Milo assailed them incredulously at the top of his voice. "Confiscate?" he shrieked, as though he could not believe his own ears. "Since when is it the policy of the American government to confiscate the private property of its citizens? Shame on you. Shame on all of you for even thinking such a horrible thought." "But Milo," Major Danby interrupted timidly, "we're at war with Germany, and those are German planes." "They are no such thing," Milo retorted furiously. "Those planes belong to the syndicate, and everybody has a share." "Confiscate? How could you possibly confiscate your own private property?" "Confiscate, indeed. I've never heard anything so depraved in my whole life." And sure enough, Milo was right, for when they looked, his mechanics had painted out the German swastikas on the wings, tails, and fuselages with double coats of flat white, and stenciled in the words M&M Enterprises, Fine Fruits and Produce. Right before their eyes, he had transformed his syndicate into an international cartel. Milo's argosies of plenty now filled the air. Planes poured in from Norway, Denmark, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Sweden, Finland, Poland. From everywhere in Europe, in fact, but Russia, with whom Milo refused to do business. When everybody who was going to had signed up with M&M Enterprises, Fine Fruits and Produce, Milo created a wholly owned subsidiary, M&M Enterprises Fancy Pastry, and obtained more airplanes and more money from the mess funds for scones and crumpets from the British Isles, prune and cheese Danish from Copenhagen, eclairs, cream puffs, Napoleons, and petit fours from Paris, Reims, and Grenoble, Kugelhopf, Pumpernickel, and Pfefferkuchen from Berlin, Linzer and Dobos-Torten from Vienna, Strudel from Hungary, and Baklava from Ankara. Each morning, Milo sent planes aloft all over Europe and North Africa, hauling long red tow signs advertising the day's specials in large square letters. I round, 79 cents. Whiting, 21 cents. He boosted cash income for the syndicate by leasing tow signs to Pet Milk, Gaines Dog Food, and Noxzema. In a spirit of civic enterprise, he regularly allotted a certain amount of free aerial advertising space to General Peckham for the propagation of such messages in the public interest as "neatness counts," "haste makes waste," and "the family that prays together stays together." Milo purchased spot radio announcements on Axis Sally's and Lord Haw Haw's daily propaganda broadcasts from Berlin to keep things moving. Business boomed on every battlefront. Milo's planes were a familiar sight. They had freedom of passage everywhere. And one day, Milo contracted with the American military authorities to bomb the German-held highway bridge at Orvieto, and with the German military authorities to defend the highway bridge at Orvieto with anti-aircraft fire against his own attack. His fee for attacking the bridge for America was the total cost of the operation plus 6%. And his fee from Germany for defending the bridge was the same cost plus 6 agreement, augmented by a merit bonus of $1,000 for every American plane he shot down. The consummation of these deals represented an important victory for private enterprise, he pointed out, since the armies of both countries were socialized institutions. Once the contracts were signed, there seemed to be no point in using the resources of the syndicate to bomb and defend the bridge, inasmuch as both governments had ample men and material right there to do so, and were perfectly happy to contribute them. And in the end, Milo realized a fantastic profit from both halves of his project for doing nothing more than signing his name twice. The arrangements were fair to both sides. Since Milo did have freedom of passage everywhere, his planes were able to steal over in a sneak attack without alerting the German anti-aircraft gunners. And since Milo knew about the attack, he was able to alert the German anti-aircraft gunners in sufficient time for them to begin firing accurately the moment the planes came into range. It was an ideal arrangement for everyone but the dead man in Yossarian's tent, who was killed over the target the day he arrived. "I didn't kill him," Milo kept replying passionately to Yossarian's angry protest. "I wasn't even there that day, I tell you. Do you think I was down there on the ground firing an anti-aircraft gun when the planes came over?" "But you organized the whole thing, didn't you?" Yossarian shouted back at him in the velvet darkness cloaking the path leading past the still vehicles of the motor pool to the open-air movie theater. "And I didn't organize anything," Milo answered indignantly, drawing great agitated sniffs of air in through his hissing, pale, twitching nose. "The Germans have the bridge, and we were going to bomb it whether I stepped into the picture or not. I just saw a wonderful opportunity to make some profit out of the mission, and I took it. What's so terrible about that?" "What's so terrible about it? Milo, a man in my tent was killed on that mission before he could even unpack his bags." "But I didn't kill him." "You got $1,000 extra for it." "But I didn't kill him. I wasn't even there, I tell you. I was in Barcelona buying olive oil and skinless and boneless sardines. And I've got the purchase orders to prove it. And I didn't get the $1,000. That $1,000 went to the syndicate, and everybody got a share, even you." Milo was appealing to Yossarian from the bottom of his soul. "Look, I didn't start this war, Yossarian, no matter what that lousy wintergreen is saying. I'm just trying to put it on a business-like basis. Is anything wrong with that? You know, $1,000 ain't such a bad price for a medium bomber and a crew. If I can persuade the Germans to pay me $1,000 for every plane they shoot down, why shouldn't I take it?" You know, $1,000 ain't such a bad price for a medium bomber and a crew. If I can persuade the Germans to pay me $1,000 for every plane they shoot down, why shouldn't I take it? Because you're dealing with the enemy, that's why. Can't you understand that we're fighting a war? People are dying. Look around you, for Christ's sake. Milo shook his head with weary forbearance. "And the Germans are not our enemies," he declared. "Oh, I know what you're going to say. Sure, we're at war with them. But the Germans are also members in good standing of the syndicate, and it's my job to protect their rights as shareholders. Maybe they did start the war, and maybe they are killing millions of people, but they pay their bills a lot more promptly than some allies of ours I could name. Don't you understand that I have to respect the sanctity of my contract with Germany? Can't you see it from my point of view?" "No," Yossarian rebuffed him harshly. Milo was stung and made no effort to disguise his wounded feelings. It was a muggy, moonlit night filled with gnats, moths, and mosquitoes. Milo lifted his arm suddenly and pointed toward the open-air theater, where the milky, dust-filled beam bursting horizontally from the projector slashed a cone-like swath in the blackness, and draped in a fluorescent membrane of light, the audience tilted on the seats there in hypnotic sags, their faces focused upward toward the illuminized movie screen. Milo's eyes were liquid with integrity, and his artless and uncorrupted face was lustrous with a shining mixture of sweat and insect repellent. "Look at them," he exclaimed in a voice choked with emotion. "They're my friends, my countrymen, my comrades in arms. A fellow never had a better bunch of buddies. Do you think I'd do a single thing to harm them if I didn't have to? Haven't I got enough on my mind? Can't you see how upset I am already about all that cotton piling up on those piers in Egypt?" Milo's voice splintered into fragments, and he clutched at Yossarian's shirt front as though drowning. His eyes were throbbing visibly like brown caterpillars. "Yossarian, what am I going to do with so much cotton? It's all your fault for letting me buy it." The cotton was piling up on the piers in Egypt, and nobody wanted any. Milo had never dreamed that the Nile Valley could be so fertile, or that there would be no market at all for the crop he had bought. The mess halls in his syndicate would not help. They rose up in uncompromising rebellion against his proposal to tax them on a per capita basis in order to enable each man to own his own share of the Egyptian cotton crop. Even his reliable friends the Germans failed him in this crisis. They preferred ersatz. Milo's mess halls would not even help him store the cotton, and his warehousing costs skyrocketed and contributed to the devastating drain upon his cash reserves. The profits from the Orvieto mission were sucked away. He began writing home for the money he had sent back in better days. Soon that was almost gone. And now bales of cotton kept arriving on the wharves at Alexandria every day. Each time he succeeded in dumping some on the world market for a loss, but it was snapped up by canny Egyptian brokers in the Levant, who sold it back to him at the original contract price, so that he was really worse off than before. M&M Enterprises verged on collapse. Milo cursed himself hourly for his monumental greed and stupidity in purchasing the entire Egyptian cotton crop. But a contract was a contract and had to be honored. And one night, after a sumptuous evening meal, all Milo's fighters and bombers took off, joined in formation directly overhead, and began dropping bombs on the group. He had landed another contract with the Germans, this time to bomb his own outfit. Milo's planes separated in a well-coordinated attack and bombed the fuel stocks and the ordnance dump, the repair hangars, and the B-25 bombers resting on the lollipop-shaped hardstands at the field. His crews spared the landing strip and the mess halls so that they could land safely when their work was done and enjoy a hot snack before retiring. They bombed with their landing lights on since no one was shooting back. They bombed all 4 squadrons, the officers' club, and the group headquarters building. Men bolted from their tents in sheer terror and did not know in which direction to turn. Wounded soon lay screaming everywhere. A cluster of fragmentation bombs exploded in the yard of the officers' club and punched jagged holes in the side of the wooden building and in the bellies and backs of a row of lieutenants and captains standing at the bar. They doubled over in agony and dropped. The rest of the officers fled toward the 2 exits in panic and jammed up the doorways like a dense, howling dam of human flesh as they shrank from going farther. Colonel Cathcart clawed and elbowed his way through the unruly, bewildered mass until he stood outside by himself. He stared up at the sky in stark astonishment and horror. Milo's planes, ballooning serenely in over the blossoming treetops with their bomb bay doors open and wing flaps down, and with their monstrous, bug-eyed, blinding, fiercely flickering, eerie landing lights on, were the most apocalyptic sight he had ever beheld. Colonel Cathcart let go a stricken gasp of dismay and hurled himself headlong into his jeep, almost sobbing. He found the gas pedal and the ignition and sped toward the airfield as fast as the rocking car would carry him, his huge, flabby hands clenched and bloodless on the wheel, or blaring his horn tormentedly. Once he almost killed himself when he swerved with a banshee screech of tires to avoid plowing into a bunch of men running crazily toward the hills in their underwear, with their stunned faces down and their thin arms pressed high around their temples as puny shields. Yellow, orange, and red fires were burning on both sides of the road. Tents and trees were in flames, and Milo's planes kept coming around interminably with their blinking white landing lights on and their bomb bay doors open. Colonel Cathcart almost turned the Jeep over when he slammed the brakes on at the control tower. He leaped from the car while it was still skidding dangerously and hurtled up the flight of steps inside, where 3 men were busy at the instruments and the controls. He bowled 2 of them aside in his lunge for the nickel-plated microphone, his eyes glittering wildly, and his beefy face contorted with stress. He squeezed the microphone in a bestial grip and began shouting hysterically at the top of his voice, "Milo, you son of a bitch! Are you crazy? What the hell are you doing? Come down! Come down!" "Stop hollering so much, will you?" answered Milo, who was standing there right beside him in the control tower with a microphone of his own. "I'm right here." Milo looked at him with reproof and turned back to his microphone. "Very good, men, very good," he chanted into his microphone. "But I see 1 supply shed still standing. That will never do, Purvis. I've spoken to you about that kind of shoddy work before. Now you go right back there this minute and try it again. And this time come in slowly, slowly. Haste makes waste, Purvis. Haste makes waste. If I've told you that once, I must have told you 100 times. Haste makes waste." The loudspeaker overhead began squawking, "Milo, this is Alvin Brown. I've finished dropping my bombs. What should I do now?" "Strafe," said Milo. "Strafe?" Alvin Brown was shocked. "We have no choice," Milo informed him resignedly. "It's in the contract." "Oh, okay then," Alvin Brown acquiesced. "In that case, I'll strafe." This time, Milo had gone too far. Bombing his own men and planes was more than even the most phlegmatic observer could stomach, and it looked like the end for him. High-ranking government officials poured in to investigate. Newspapers inveighed against Milo with glaring headlines, and congressmen denounced the atrocity in stentorian wrath and clamored for punishment. Mothers with children in the service organized into militant groups and demanded revenge. Not one voice was raised in his defense. Decent people everywhere were affronted, and Milo was all washed up, until he opened his books to the public and disclosed the tremendous profit he had made. He could reimburse the government for all the people and property he had destroyed, and still have enough money left over to continue buying Egyptian cotton. Everybody, of course, owned a share, and the sweetest part of the whole deal was that there really was no need to reimburse the government at all. In a democracy, the government is the people, Milo explained. We're people, aren't we? So we might just as well keep the money and eliminate the middleman. Frankly, I'd like to see the government get out of war altogether and leave the whole field to private industry. If we pay the government everything we owe it, we'll only be encouraging government control and discouraging other individuals from bombing their own men and planes. We'll be taking away their incentive. Milo was correct, of course, as everyone soon agreed, but a few embittered misfits like Dr. Nika, who sulked cantankerously and muttered offensive insinuations about the morality of the whole venture, until Milo mollified him with a donation in the name of the syndicate of a lightweight aluminum collapsible garden chair that Dr. Nika could fold up conveniently and carry outside his tent each time Chief White Half-Oat came inside his tent, and carry back inside his tent each time Chief White Half-Oat came out. Dr. Nika had lost his head during Milo's bombardment. Instead of running for cover, he had remained out in the open and performed his duty, slithering along the ground through shrapnel, strafing, and incendiary bombs like a furtive, wily lizard from casualty to casualty, administering tourniquets, morphine, splints, and sulfanilamide with a dark and doleful visage, never saying one word more than he had to, and reading in each man's bluing wound a dreadful portent of his own decay. He worked himself relentlessly into exhaustion before the long night was over, and came down with a sniffle the next day that sent him hurrying querulously into the medical tent to have his temperature taken by Gus and Wes, and to obtain a mustard plaster and vaporizer. Dr. Nika tended each moaning man that night with the same glum and profound and introverted grief he showed at the airfield the day of the Avignon mission, when Yossarian climbed down the few steps of his plane naked, in a state of utter shock, with Snowden smeared abundantly all over his bare heels and toes, knees, arms, and fingers, and pointed inside wordlessly toward where the young radio gunner lay freezing to death on the floor, beside the still younger tail gunner, who kept falling back into a dead faint each time he opened his eyes and saw Snowden dying. Dr. Nika draped a blanket around Yossarian's shoulders almost tenderly after Snowden had been removed from the plane and carried into an ambulance on a stretcher. He led Yossarian toward his jeep. McWatt helped, and the three drove in silence to the squadron medical tent, where McWatt and Dr. Nika guided Yossarian inside to a chair and washed Snowden off him with cold, wet balls of absorbent cotton. Dr. Nika gave him a pill and a shot that put him to sleep for 12 hours. When Yossarian woke up and went to see him, Dr. Nika gave him another pill and a shot that put him to sleep for another 12 hours. When Yossarian woke up again and went to see him, Dr. Nika made ready to give him another pill and a shot. "How long are you going to keep giving me those pills and shots?" Yossarian asked him. "Until you feel better." "I feel all right now." Dr. Nika's fragile, sun-tanned forehead furrowed with surprise. "Then why don't you put some clothes on? Why are you walking around naked?" "I don't want to wear a uniform anymore." Dr. Nika accepted the explanation and put away his hypodermic syringe. "Are you sure you feel all right?" "I feel fine. I'm just a little logy from all those pills and shots you've been giving me." Yossarian went about his business with no clothes on all the rest of that day, and was still naked late the next morning when Milo, after hunting everywhere else, finally found him sitting up a tree a small distance in back of the quaint little military cemetery at which Snowden was being buried. Milo was dressed in his customary business attire, olive drab trousers, a fresh olive drab shirt and tie with one silver first lieutenant's bar gleaming on the collar, and a regulation dress cap with a stiff leather bill. "I've been looking all over for you," Milo called up to Yossarian from the ground reproachfully. "You should have looked for me in this tree," Yossarian answered. "I've been up here all morning. Come down and taste this and tell me if it's good. It's very important." Yossarian shook his head. He sat nude on the lowest limb of the tree and balanced himself with both hands grasping the bough directly above. He refused to budge, and Milo had no choice but to stretch both arms about the trunk in a distasteful hug and start climbing. He struggled upward clumsily with loud grunts and wheezes, and his clothes were squashed and crooked by the time he pulled himself up high enough to hook a leg over a limb and pause for breath. His dress cap was askew and in danger of falling. Milo caught it just when it began slipping. Globules of perspiration glistened like transparent pearls around his mustache and swelled like opaque blisters under his eyes. Yossarian watched him impassively. Cautiously, Milo worked himself around in a half-circle so that he could face Yossarian. He unwrapped tissue paper from something soft, round, and brown and handed it out to Yossarian. "Please taste this and let me know what you think. I'd like to serve it to the men." "What is it?" asked Yossarian and took a big bite. "Chocolate-covered cotton." Yossarian gagged convulsively and sprayed his big mouthful of chocolate-covered cotton right out into Milo's face. "Here, take it back," he spouted angrily. "Jesus Christ, have you gone crazy? You didn't even take the goddamn seeds out." "Give it a chance, will you?" Milo begged. "It can't be that bad. Is it really that bad? It's even worse. But I've got to make the mess halls feed it to the men. They'll never be able to swallow it." "They've got to swallow it," Milo ordained with dictatorial grandeur, and almost broke his neck when he let go with one arm to wave a righteous finger in the air. "Come on out here," Yossarian invited him. "You'll be much safer, and you can see everything." Gripping the bough above with both hands, Milo began inching his way out on the limb sideways with utmost care and apprehension. His face was rigid with tension, and he sighed with relief when he found himself seated securely beside Yossarian. He stroked the tree affectionately. "This is a pretty good tree," he observed admiringly with proprietary gratitude. "It's the tree of life," Yossarian answered, waggling his toes, "and of knowledge of good and evil, too." Milo squinted closely at the bark and branches. "No, it isn't," he replied. "It's a chestnut tree. I ought to know. I sell chestnuts." "Have it your way." They sat in the tree without talking for several seconds, their legs dangling and their hands almost straight up on the bough above. the one completely nude but for a pair of crepe-sole sandals, the other completely dressed in a coarse olive-drab woolen uniform with his tie knotted tight. Milo studied Yossarian diffidently through the corner of his eye, hesitating tactfully. "I want to ask you something," he said at last. "You don't have any clothes on. I don't want to butt in or anything, but I just want to know. Why aren't you wearing your uniform?" "I don't want to." Milo nodded rapidly, like a sparrow pecking. I see, he stated quickly with a look of vivid confusion. "I understand perfectly. I heard Appleby and Captain Black say you had gone crazy, and I just wanted to find out." He hesitated politely again, weighing his next question. "Aren't you ever going to put your uniform on again?" "I don't think so." Milo nodded with spurious vim to indicate he still understood, and then sat silent, ruminating gravely with troubled misgiving. A scarlet-crested bird shot by below, brushing sure dark wings against a quivering bush. Yossarian and Milo were covered in their bower by tissue-thin tiers of sloping green, and largely surrounded by other gray chestnut trees and a silver spruce. The sun was high overhead in a vast sapphire-blue sky, beaded with low, isolated, puffy clouds of dry and immaculate white. There was no breeze, and the leaves about them hung motionless. The shade was feathery. Everything was at peace but Milo, who straightened suddenly with a muffled cry and began pointing excitedly. "Look at that!" he exclaimed in alarm. "Look at that! There's a funeral going on down there. That looks like the cemetery, isn't it?" Yossarian answered him slowly in a level voice. "They're burying that kid who got killed in my plane over Avignon the other day. Snowden." "What happened to him?" Milo asked in a voice deadened with awe. "He got killed." "That's terrible," Milo grieved, and his large brown eyes filled with tears. "That poor kid, it really is terrible." He bit his trembling lip hard, and his voice rose with emotion when he continued. "And it will get even worse if the mess halls don't agree to buy my cotton. Yossarian, what's the matter with them? Don't they realize it's their syndicate? Don't they know they've all got a share?" "Did the dead man in my tent have a share?" Yossarian demanded caustically. "Of course he did," Milo assured him lavishly. "Everybody in the squadron has a share." "He was killed before he even got into the squadron." Milo made a deft grimace of tribulation and turned away. "I wish you'd stop picking on me about that dead man in your tent," he pleaded peevishly. "I told you I didn't have anything to do with killing him. Is it my fault that I saw this great opportunity to corner the market on Egyptian cotton and got us into all this trouble? Was I supposed to know there was going to be a glut? I didn't even know what a glut was in those days. An opportunity to corner a market doesn't come along very often, and I was pretty shrewd to grab the chance when I had it." Milo gulped back a moan, and he saw 6 uniformed pallbearers lift the plain pine coffin from the ambulance and set it gently down on the ground beside the yawning gash of the freshly dug grave. "And now I can't get rid of a single penny's worth," he mourned. Yossarian was unmoved by the fustian charade of the burial ceremony and by Milo's crushing bereavement. The chaplain's voice floated up to him through the distance tenuously in an unintelligible, almost inaudible monotone, like a gaseous murmur. Yossarian could make out Major by his towering and lanky aloofness, and thought he recognized Major Danby mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Major Danby had not stopped shaking since his run-in with General Dreedel. There were strands of enlisted men molded in a curve around the 3 officers, as inflexible as lumps of wood, and 4 idle gravediggers in streaked fatigues lounging indifferently on spades near the shocking, incongruous heap of loose copper-red earth. As Yossarian stared, the chaplain elevated his gaze toward Yossarian beatifically, pressed his fingers down over his eyeballs in a manner of affliction, peered upward again toward Yossarian searchingly, and bowed his head, concluding what Yossarian took to be a climactic part of the funeral rite. The 4 men in fatigues lifted the coffin on slings and lowered it into the grave. Milo shuddered violently. "I can't watch it," he cried, turning away in anguish. "I just can't sit here and watch while those mess halls let my syndicate die." He gnashed his teeth and shook his head with bitter woe and resentment. "If they had any loyalty, they would buy my cotton till it hurts, so that they can keep right on buying my cotton till it hurts them some more. They would build fires and burn up their underwear and summer uniforms just to create a bigger demand. but they won't do a thing. Yossarian, try eating the rest of this chocolate-covered cotton for me. Maybe it will taste delicious now." Yossarian pushed his hand away. "Give up, Milo. People can't eat cotton." Milo's face narrowed cunningly. "It isn't really cotton," he coaxed. "I was joking. It's really cotton candy. Delicious cotton candy. Try it and see." "Now you're lying." "I never lie," Milo rejoined with proud dignity. "You're lying now." "I only lie when it's necessary," Milo explained defensively, averting his eyes for a moment and blinking his lashes winningly. "This stuff is better than cotton candy. Really it is. It's made out of real cotton. Yossarian, you've got to help me make the men eat it. Egyptian cotton is the finest cotton in the world." "But it's indigestible," Yossarian emphasized. "It will make them sick, don't you understand? Why don't you try living on it yourself if you don't believe me?" "I did try," admitted Milo gloomily, "and it made me sick." The graveyard was yellow as hay and green as cooked cabbage. In a little while the chaplain stepped back, and the beige crescent of human forms began to break up sluggishly like flotsam. The men drifted without haste or sound to the vehicles parked along the side of the bumpy dirt road. With their heads down disconsolately, the chaplain, Major, and Major Danby moved toward their jeeps in an ostracized group, each holding himself friendlessly several feet away from the other two. "It's all over," observed Yossarian. "It's the end," Milo agreed despondently. "There's no hope left, and all because I left them free to make their own decisions. That should teach me a lesson about discipline the next time I try something like this." "Why don't you sell your cotton to the government?" Yossarian suggested casually, as he watched the four men in streaked fatigues shoveling heaping bladefuls of the copper-red earth back down inside the grave. Milo vetoed the idea brusquely. "It's a matter of principle," he explained firmly. "The government has no business in business, and I would be the last person in the world to ever try to involve the government in a business of mine. But the business of government is business," he remembered alertly, and continued with elation. "Calvin Coolidge said that, and Calvin Coolidge was a president, so it must be true. And the government does have the responsibility of buying all the Egyptian cotton I've got that no one else wants, so that I can make a profit, doesn't it?" Milo's face clouded almost as abruptly, and his spirits descended into a state of sad anxiety. "But how will I get the government to do it?" "Bribe it," Yossarian said. "Bribe it?" Milo was outraged, and almost lost his balance and broke his neck again. "Shame on you," he scolded severely, breathing virtuous fire down and upward into his rusty mustache, through his billowing nostrils and prim lips. "Bribery is against the law, and you know it. But it's not against the law to make a profit, is it? So it can't be against the law for me to bribe someone in order to make a fair profit, can it? No, of course not." He fell to brooding again with a meek, almost pitiable distress. "But how will I know who to bribe?" "Oh, don't worry about that," Yossarian comforted him with a toneless snicker as the engines of the jeeps and ambulance fractured the drowsy silence, and the vehicles in the rear began driving away backward. "You make the bribe big enough and they'll find you. Just make sure you do everything right out in the open. Let everyone know exactly what you want and how much you're willing to pay for it. The first time you act guilty or ashamed, you might get into trouble." "I wish you'd come with me," Milo remarked. "I won't feel safe among people who take bribes. They're no better than a bunch of crooks." "You'll be all right," Yossarian assured him with confidence. "If you run into trouble, just tell everybody that the security of the country requires a strong domestic Egyptian cotton speculating industry." "It does," Milo informed him solemnly. "A strong Egyptian cotton speculating industry means a much stronger America." "Of course it does. And if that doesn't work, point out the great number of American families that depend on it for income. A great many American families do depend on it for income." "You see," said Yossarian, "you're much better at it than I am. You almost make it sound true." "It is true," Milo exclaimed with a strong trace of the old hauteur. "That's what I mean. You do it with just the right amount of conviction. You're sure you won't come with me?" Yossarian shook his head. Milo was impatient to get started. He stuffed the remainder of the chocolate-covered cotton ball into his shirt pocket and edged his way back gingerly along the branch to the smooth gray trunk. He threw his arms about the trunk in a generous and awkward embrace and began shinnying down, the sides of his leather-soled shoes slipping constantly, so that it seemed many times he would fall and injure himself. Halfway down, he changed his mind and climbed back up, Bits of tree bark stuck to his mustache, and his straining face was flushed with exertion. "I wish you'd put your uniform on instead of going around naked that way," he confided pensively, before he climbed back down again and hurried away. "You might start a trend, and then I'll never get rid of all this gall-darned cotton." Chapter 25. The Chaplain. It was already some time since the chaplain had first begun wondering what everything was all about. Was there a God? How could he be sure? Being an Anabaptist minister in the American Army was difficult enough under the best of circumstances. Without dogma, it was almost intolerable. People with loud voices frightened him. Brave, aggressive men of action like Colonel Cathcart left him feeling helpless and alone. Wherever he went in the Army, he was a stranger. Enlisted men and officers did not conduct themselves with him as they conducted themselves with other enlisted men and officers, and even other chaplains were not as friendly toward him as they were toward each other. In a world in which success was the only virtue, he had resigned himself to failure. He was painfully aware that he lacked the ecclesiastical aplomb and savoir-faire that enabled so many of his colleagues in other faiths and sects to get ahead. He was just not equipped to excel. He thought of himself as ugly and wanted daily to be home with his wife. Actually, the chaplain was almost good-looking, with a pleasant, sensitive face as pale and brittle as sandstone. His mind was open on every subject. Perhaps he really was Washington Irving, and perhaps he really had been signing Washington Irving's name to those letters he knew nothing about. Such lapses of memory were not uncommon in medical annals, he knew. There was no way of really knowing anything, he knew, not even that there was no way of really knowing anything. He remembered very distinctly, or was under the impression he remembered very distinctly, his feeling that he had met Yossarian somewhere before, the first time he had met Yossarian lying in bed in the hospital. He remembered experiencing the same disquieting sensation almost 2 weeks later when Yossarian appeared at his tent to ask to be taken off combat duty. By that time, of course, the chaplain had met Yossarian somewhere before, in that odd, unorthodox ward in which every patient seemed delinquent, but the unfortunate patient covered from head to toe in white bandages and plaster, who was found dead one day with a thermometer in his mouth. But the chaplain's impression of a prior meeting was of some occasion far more momentous and occult than that, of a significant encounter with Yossarian in some remote, submerged, and perhaps even entirely spiritual epoch in which he had made the identical foredooming admission that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, he could do to help him. Doubts of such kind gnawed at the chaplain's lean, suffering frame insatiably. Was there a single true faith or a life after death? How many angels could dance on the head of a pin? And with what matters did God occupy himself in all the infinite eons before the creation? Why was it necessary to put a protective seal on the brow of Cain if there were no other people to protect him from? Did Adam and Eve produce daughters? These were the great complex questions of ontology that tormented him. Yet they never seemed nearly as crucial to him as the question of kindness and good manners. He was pinched perspiringly in the epistemological dilemma of the skeptic, unable to accept solutions to problems he was unwilling to dismiss as unsolvable. He was never without misery and never without hope. "Have you ever," he inquired hesitatingly of Yossarian that day in his tent as Yossarian sat holding in both hands the warm bottle of Coca-Cola with which the chaplain had been able to solace him, "been in a situation which you felt you had been in before, even though you knew you were experiencing it for the first time?" Yossarian nodded perfunctorily, and the chaplain's breath quickened in anticipation as he made ready to join his willpower with Yossarian's in a prodigious effort to rip away at last the voluminous black folds shrouding the eternal mysteries of existence. "Do you have that feeling now?" Yossarian shook his head and explained that déjà vu was just a momentary, infinitesimal lag in the operation of two coactive sensory nerve centers that commonly functioned simultaneously. The chaplain scarcely heard him. He was disappointed, but not inclined to believe Yossarian, for he had been given a sign, a secret enigmatic vision that he still lacked the boldness to divulge. There was no mistaking the awesome implications of the chaplain's revelation. It was either an insight of divine origin or a hallucination. He was either blessed or losing his mind. Both prospects filled him with equal fear and depression. It was neither déjà vu, presque vu, nor jamais vu. It was possible that there were other views of which he had never heard, and that one of these other views would explain succinctly the baffling phenomenon of which he had been both a witness and a part. It was even possible that none of what he thought had taken place really had taken place, that he was dealing with an aberration of memory rather than of perception, that he never really had thought he had seen what he now thought he once did think he had seen, that his impression now that he once had thought so was merely the illusion of an illusion, and that he was only now imagining that he had ever once imagined seeing a naked man sitting in a tree at the cemetery. It was obvious to the chaplain now that he was not particularly well suited to his work, and he often speculated whether he might not be happier serving in some other branch of the service, as a private in the infantry or field artillery perhaps, or even as a paratrooper. He had no real friends. Before meeting Yossarian, there was no one in the group with whom he felt at ease, and he was hardly at ease with Yossarian, whose frequent rash and insubordinate outbursts kept him almost constantly on edge, and in an ambiguous state of enjoyable trepidation. The chaplain felt safe when he was at the officers' club with Yossarian and Dunbar, and even with just Nately and McWatt. When he sat with them, he had no need to sit with anyone else. His problem of where to sit was solved, and he was protected against the undesired company of all those fellow officers who invariably welcomed him with excessive cordiality when he approached, and waited uncomfortably for him to go away. He made so many people uneasy. Everyone was always very friendly toward him, and no one was ever very nice. Everyone spoke to him, and no one ever said anything. Yossarian and Dunbar were much more relaxed, and the chaplain was hardly uncomfortable with them at all. They even defended him the night Colonel Cathcart tried to throw him out of the officers' club again, Yossarian rising truculently to intervene, and Nately shouting out, "Yossarian!" to restrain him. Colonel Cathcart turned white as a sheet at the sound of Yossarian's name, and to everyone's amazement retreated in horrified disorder until he bumped into General Dreedel, who elbowed him away with annoyance and ordered him right back to order the chaplain to start coming into the officers' club every night again. The chaplain had almost as much trouble keeping track of his status at the officers' club as he had remembering at which of the 10 mess halls in the group he was scheduled to eat his next meal. He would just as soon have remained kicked out of the officers' club had it not been for the pleasure he was now finding there with his new companions. If the chaplain did not go to the officers' club at night, there was no place else he could go. He would pass the time at Yossarian's and Dunbar's table with a shy and reticent smile, seldom speaking unless addressed, a glass of thick sweet wine almost untasted before him as he toyed unfamiliarly with the tiny corncob pipe that he affected self-consciously and occasionally stuffed with tobacco and smoked. He enjoyed listening to Nately, whose maudlin, bittersweet lamentations mirrored much of his own romantic desolation, and never failed to evoke in him resurgent tides of longing for his wife and children. The chaplain would encourage Nately with nods of comprehension or assent, amused by his candor and immaturity. Nately did not glory too immodestly that his girl was a prostitute, and the chaplain's awareness stemmed mainly from Captain Black, who never slouched past their table without a broad wink at the chaplain and some tasteless, wounding jibe about her to Nately. The chaplain did not approve of Captain Black, and found it difficult not to wish him evil. No one, not even Nately, seemed really to appreciate that he, Chaplain Albert Taylor Tapman, was not just a chaplain, but a human being, that he could have a charming, passionate, pretty wife whom he loved almost insanely, and 3 small, blue-eyed children with strange, forgotten faces, who would grow up someday to regard him as a freak, and who might never forgive him for all the social embarrassment his vocation would cause them. Why couldn't anybody understand that he was not really a freak, but a normal, lonely adult trying to lead a normal, lonely adult life? If they pricked him, didn't he bleed? And if he was tickled, didn't he laugh? It seemed never to have occurred to them that he, just as they, had eyes, hands, organs, dimensions, senses, and affections, that he was wounded by the same kind of weapons they were, warmed and cooled by the same breezes, and fed by the same kind of food, although he was forced to concede in a different mess hall for each successive meal. The only person who did seem to realize he had feelings was Corporal Whitcomb, who had just managed to bruise them all by going over his head to Colonel Cathcart with his proposal for sending form letters of condolence home to the families of men killed or wounded in combat. The chaplain's wife was the one thing in the world he could be certain of, and it would have been sufficient if only he had been left to live his life out with just her and the children. The chaplain's wife was a reserved, diminutive, agreeable woman in her early 30s, very dark and very attractive, with a narrow waist, calm, intelligent eyes, and small, bright, pointy teeth in a childlike face that was vivacious and petite. He kept forgetting what his children looked like, and each time he returned to their snapshots, it was like seeing their faces for the first time. The chaplain loved his wife and children with such tameless intensity that he often wanted to sink to the ground helplessly and weep like a castaway cripple. He was tormented inexorably by morbid fantasies involving them, by dire, hideous omens of illness and accident. His meditations were polluted with threats of dread diseases like Ewing's tumor and leukemia. He saw his infant son die 2 or 3 times every week because he had never taught his wife how to stop arterial bleeding. Watched in tearful, paralyzed silence, his whole family electrocuted, one after the other, at a baseboard socket because he had never told her that a human body would conduct electricity. All 4 went up in flames almost every night when the water heater exploded and set the 2-story wooden house afire. In ghastly, heartless, revolting detail, he saw his poor dear wife's trim and fragile body crushed to a viscous pulp against the brick wall of a market building by a half-witted, drunken automobile driver, and watched his hysterical 5-year-old daughter being led away from the grisly scene by a kindly middle-aged gentleman with snow-white hair who raped and murdered her repeatedly as soon as he had driven her off to a deserted sand pit, while his 2 younger children starved to death slowly in the house after his wife's mother, who had been babysitting, dropped dead from a heart attack when news of his wife's accident was given to her over the telephone. The chaplain's wife was a sweet, soothing, considerate woman, and he yearned to touch the warm flesh of her slender arm again, and stroke her smooth black hair, to hear her intimate, comforting voice. She was a much stronger person than he was. He wrote brief, untroubled letters to her once a week, sometimes twice. He wanted to write urgent love letters to her all day long and crowd the endless pages with desperate, uninhibited confessions of his humble worship and need, and with careful instructions for administering artificial respiration. He wanted to pour out to her in torrents of self-pity all his unbearable loneliness and despair, and warn her never to leave the boric acid or the aspirin in reach of the children, or to cross the street against the traffic light. He did not wish to worry her. The chaplain's wife was intuitive, gentle, compassionate, and responsive. Almost inevitably, his reveries of reunion with her ended in explicit acts of lovemaking. The chaplain felt most deceitful presiding at funerals, and it would not have astonished him to learn that the apparition in the tree that day was a manifestation of the Almighty's censure for the blasphemy and pride inherent in his function. To simulate gravity, feign grief, and pretend supernatural intelligence of the hereafter in so fearsome and arcane a circumstance as death seemed the most criminal of offenses. He recalled, or was almost convinced he recalled, the scene of the cemetery perfectly. He could still see Major Major and Major Danby standing somber as broken stone pillars on either side of him, see almost the exact number of enlisted men and almost the exact places in which they had stood, see the 4 unmoving men with spades, the repulsive coffin and the large, loose, triumphant mound of reddish-brown earth, and the massive, still, depthless, muffling sky, so weirdly blank and blue that day it was almost poisonous. He would remember them forever, for they were all part and parcel of the most extraordinary event that had ever befallen him, an event perhaps marvelous, perhaps pathological, the vision of the naked man in the tree. How could he explain it? It was not already seen, or never seen, and certainly not almost seen. Neither déjà vu, jamais vu, nor presque vu was elastic enough to cover it. Was it a ghost, then? The dead man's soul? An angel from heaven or a minion from hell? Or was the whole fantastic episode merely the figment of a diseased imagination, his own, of a deteriorating mind, a rotting brain? The possibility that there really had been a naked man in the tree, 2 men actually, since the first had been joined shortly by a second man clad in a brown mustache and sinister dark garments from head to toe, who bent forward ritualistically along the limb of the tree to offer the first man something to drink from a brown goblet, never crossed the chaplain's mind. The chaplain was sincerely a very helpful person who was never able to help anyone, not even Yossarian, when he finally decided to seize the bull by the horns and visit Major secretly to learn if, as Yossarian had said, the men in Colonel Cathcart's group really were being forced to fly more combat missions than anyone else. It was a daring, impulsive move on which the chaplain decided after quarreling with Corporal Whitcomb again and washing down with tepid canteen water his joyless lunch of a Milky Way and Baby Ruth. He went to Major on foot so that Corporal Whitcomb would not see him leaving, stealing into the forest noiselessly until the 2 tents in his clearing were left behind, then dropping down inside the abandoned railroad ditch where the footing was surer. He hurried along the fossilized wooden ties with accumulating mutinous anger. He had been browbeaten and humiliated successively that morning by Colonel Cathcart, Colonel Corn, and Corporal Whitcomb. He just had to make himself felt in some respect. His slight chest was soon puffing for breath. He moved as swiftly as he could without breaking into a run, fearing his resolution might dissolve if he slowed. Soon he saw a uniformed figure coming toward him between the rusted rails. He clambered immediately up the side of the ditch, ducked inside a dense copse of low trees for concealment, and sped along in his original direction on a narrow, overgrown, mossy path he found winding deep inside the shaded forest. It was tougher going there, but he plunged ahead with the same reckless and consuming determination, slipping and stumbling often, and stinging his unprotected hands on the stubborn branches, blocking his way until the bushes and tall ferns on both sides spread open, and he lurched past an olive-drab military trailer on cinder blocks, clearly visible through the thinning underbrush. He continued past a tent with a luminous pearl-gray cat sunning itself outside, and past another trailer on cinder blocks, and then burst into the clearing of Yossarian's squadron.